debut episode of Spring Soundoff here in the Gazette studio. Carson Field here, and joining me today we have Brent Briggeman, sports editor and Air Force football beat writer at the Gazette. Brent, how are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks, Carson, for getting this going. I'm excited. As he said, I'm sports editor. I have been for about a month and a half, and some of the things we hope to do are to bring you a little bit wider array of ways to bring you sports news in the Colorado Springs community. And one of the ways will be this podcast, and Carson's expertise, as he arrived last week, is putting this together. So we're going to jump right in this week with a big one with Air Force CU.
You mentioned it. I mean, it's hard to ask for a more fun time of the sports season here in Colorado Springs. Air Force football is one of the big draws of this area. This week, they play against a team also from the Centennial State, the Colorado Buffaloes. Colorado lost their opener to TCU. Air Force, of course, beat Northern Iowa 48-17 in the opening game. You were out there covering it. Just what were your overall thoughts from game one?
Well, it was funny. In spring ball, I talked to Dane Kinnaman, Air Force tailback or slot receiver. It's kind of interchangeable positions. And, he had the tall task of replacing Brandon Lewis, who had a huge second half of last season. And that position has seen big plays for years. And I asked him, does he have the speed to be the next Brandon Lewis or Ben Waters? And he said, I don't know. Well, we found out really quickly because in the first quarter, he caught a pass for 80 yards and had a run for 71 yards. So Dane Kinnaman showed that he can be that big play guy Air Force needs. And really, that was the only question mark coming into the season because every other box seemed to be checked, especially on offense, because they had Brad Roberts back at tailback after running for almost 1,400 yards last year. Zeke Daniels at quarterback. The question was just who can get behind the defense. And once he showed he could do that, the game just really rolled for Air Force, as you would expect against an FCS team, but this wasn't a typical FCS team, as we wrote about a lot last week. Northern Iowa comes in with a big pedigree. They've been to the playoffs. They're a perennial playoff team, basically, in the FCS. So this was not kind of the cupcake you would expect to see in the opener.
Kinnaman was one of 5 rushers on the Air Force squad that had more than 75 yards. That just signals a lot of depth as far as weapons and in the backfield. What does that make you think of for this offense?
Yeah, I've seen that a lot, not only from Air Force, especially in the openers, because they do tend to go deep into their bench. Sure. I didn't know that was going to happen against Northern Iowa, but it was, Jalen Johnson ran for a 71-yard touchdown or an 80-yard touchdown that was spectacular. I didn't see that coming. John Lee Eldridge III looked really good on the ground. Of course, Zeke Daniels, the other guys we've seen before. So, it would be more surprising to me, honestly, if Air Force didn't have depth in the backfield because they lean on that so heavily, and they always have guys ready to step in and do that. So it was, I think, if you're an Air Force fan, it had to be relieving to see that there are plenty of options. But again, that's one of those things you kind of learn to bank on as you follow this team.
We talked a little bit about the offense, but defense, they didn't allow a touchdown until the fourth quarter. They scored 14 points in garbage time, but 3 points through the first 3 quarters. That's pretty impressive. You talked about the pedigree of an FCS team like Northern Iowa, one of the stronger programs in that subdivision. What did you just see as the biggest strengths from that side of the ball?
Yeah, well, Trey Taylor, safety, came into the press conference yesterday, and he praised Northern Iowa. He said from a speed perspective, the receivers they saw on Saturday are going to get them ready. He said they're as fast receivers as they're going to see this year, getting in and out of breaks. They may not have the size they're going to see from other teams, especially this week against Colorado, but they did get a good look in terms of, again, the speed, the way they spread out the offense. And Northern Iowa did move the ball between the 20s. They were effective. They had 200 yards of total offense at halftime. But Air Force really clamped down when they needed to. They were aided by a legal procedure penalty at one point by Northern Iowa that kind of thwarted a drive and ended up in a field goal. And then T.D. Blackman forced a fumble inside the 5. So really, that could have been 14 points right there for Northern Iowa that weren't, taken off the board. So, Air Force had some issues, but I think, if anything, it made that kind of the best of all worlds scenario because they did get a real look in the opener. I've seen a number of these games, and some of them get to be, 60-0, and you really wonder what Air Force not only showed, but what they really learned internally. And I think this was a game where, because Northern Iowa brought it, they were able to see what worked, what didn't work, and within the framework of a pretty vanilla, game plan. Air Force wasn't going to show everything defensively. They weren't bringing the pressure. So there's still a lot Air Force needs to show and will show. But I do think they learned a lot, and it wasn't a superb performance overall, but I think they showed that they could make plays when they need to, And that, that's always a good personality trait to have as a defense.
Looking at the Buffaloes from Boulder, I mean, they lost by 3 scores to a pretty good TCU team. TCU is one that usually makes bowl games, a pretty consistent program. But the biggest thing they struggle with against the Horned Frogs, stopping the run. I mean, we just talked about how many weapons Air Force has. How does that really play into the Falcons' strengths?
I mean, I think one caveat you have to remember is the size of CU's defensive line. And for, at TCU, they match that size with their offensive line. Air Force isn't going to match that. So that is one thing you need to watch for. If Air Force isn't able to establish the run up the middle, they'll poke and prod and see where it's working and they'll get to the outside. But if Brad Roberts and the host of fullbacks aren't able to find yards up the middle, that might make things trickier. But, we've seen them adapt when that has happened before. And obviously that's the way Air Force is going to attack this game. They're going to make the safeties crowd up, and then they're going to take their shots over the top. But if they're not able to establish the inside, and if the speed on the outside isn't, real favorable for them, you can see where this could be a little bit of a difficult matchup in that regard. But yeah, the way TCU is running the ball and just the deflating nature of that loss, I think in general, really has to make you think this is one that Air Force should take.
Sure. I mean, Colorado also a team that kind of has a little bit of a quarterback battle going. They have Brendan Lewis, who's a little bit of more of a dual threat quarterback, and then they have JT Shrout, the pocket passer. Both of them saw reps against TCU. Both did some good things. Both did some bad things. Obviously, with any quarterback battle comes a little bit of controversy and turmoil. But at the same time, does that make it harder, do you think, to prepare for Air Force that they don't really know who's going to be the primary guy?
That is certainly a variable. Air Force will have to split reps, but at the same time, CU is going to be splitting reps between these guys in practice. So you don't know that one of them is going to be quite as ready as you would be if it was a clear number one. But yeah, that's always a challenge for Air Force. And it's a new offensive coordinator for CU. So, you're looking back into his background. Air Force had played him with Boise State and I think some other teams too in his background. So they've been researching him. But yeah, when you're preparing for two quarterbacks who are very different quarterbacks, obviously, too, that's one thing. It was funny. I mentioned Trey Taylor. He was teammates in Little League with Brendan Lewis in North Dallas. So they've known each other since they were about 6 years old. So he said he's got some tendencies he's going to be picking up from him, and they're still good friends and their families are friends. So that'll be kind of an interesting wrinkle to the matchup.
Definitely.
But again, I think if one of those quarterbacks had proven to be dominant, we wouldn't be talking about both of them. So I think, that is also one of those things you have to consider. Yes, there's two of them, but as, the old saying, if you have two quarterbacks, you really don't have one. Right. I don't know the CU's there yet, but obviously that's a red flag that could be the situation.
No, for sure. And today the weather's in the 80s, but game day it looks like high is going to be in the 50s, a lot of rain in the forecast. Do you think that affects both teams pretty equally, so it's kind of a wash, or do you think one team kind of gets the advantage from that?
Yeah, I know you're coming in from Texas, so you see 50s and you think
that's a little cold for me.
You think freezing. I don't think it's a drastic enough temperature change to really be a big factor. Other than you're probably going to see a little bit less cramping that you usually see early in the season. Hot games, a lot of guys go out for a little while with cramps, especially if CU's defense gets into the situation where Air Force is picking up first downs and they got to stay on the field for a while. Cooler temperatures actually can help them because, again, you won't run into that cramping. But, and if it gets really wet, obviously CU's probably going to be the one throwing the ball a little more. Mm-hmm. But, when Air Force does, if the ball gets slippery and they have their one shot and they miss it because of that, then that can factor in. But again, what I see in the forecast, it's not like we're talking about 12 inches of snow or something that really is going to change the game drastically. So, if anything, I think it might make the game a little more comfortable for fans than it would be if it was in upper 90s. But I think it's going to be a great day at Falcon Stadium, and I don't see the weather really impacting what we see.
Last time these teams played was 2019 when Air Force overcame a 10-0 deficit, won that game. These teams don't play every year, but still kind of a rivalry for some bragging rights. State of Colorado just trying to be the more dominant program. This is the first time that these teams were playing at Falcon Stadium since the 1970s. That's a big deal. What are just the overall stakes, do you think, for this one?
I mean, talking to the players, they're big. Air Force always stays grounded in week by week, want to know every week, but they know that these chances are few and far between for in-state bragging rights, and they do get to play both teams, CSU and CU this year. They did that in 2019 and swept them. and had a little fun with that. Calling themselves the Kings of Colorado and
State champs,
yeah, it was pretty cool. And obviously the history in this, there was a 50-year gap for a reason. Because at the height of the Vietnam era, you had two very much diametrically opposed campuses, and there were some incidents, and basically Air Force pulled out of this series because they were just, yeah, things were said, things were thrown. It got pretty ugly. At a pretty rough time in our country's history. So, these teams that are only 100 miles apart or whatever hadn't played. And so it's been great to see these games, and I think the players understand how rare and how cool this is based on the history, based on playing a Power 5 team. I mean, Air Force especially, not a lot of these players had Power 5 offers. There's a sprinkling here and there, but most of them you're looking at either preferred walk-ons or Ivy League or some smaller schools, so they don't get the chance to play Pac-12 very often, and that means something. So you got the in-state rivalry, the history, the chip on your shoulder aspect of playing a Power 5. So I think there's a whole lot that goes into this for Air Force. I don't know that the same can be said for CU.
Sure.
Obviously some of these guys were around in 2019, and you don't want to lose to your in-state little brother.
Right.
You're the Power
Right.
5 and they're the Group of 5. But I don't know that is the same kind of motivating factor as it is when you're playing up.
A lot of intrigue in this game. I mean, 1:30 kickoff on CBS. And we've heard the Air Force perspective. Let's hear a little bit about the Buffaloes. Joining me now, we have college football reporter for the Denver Gazette, Tyler King, as well as Denver Gazette sports editor, Paul Klee. Guys, thank you so much for being here. And Tyler, I mean, the game got ugly at the end of it. It was 38-13 final score against TCU, but I mean, a very close first half, very low scoring first half, 7-6. What did the Buffaloes do well defensively in the first half?
I think what they did well defensively was not be on the field, because I think, CU really dominated time of possession in the first half. I think it was about a little bit 22 minutes to 8 minutes. I mean, CU, even though they only had the 2 field goals, really had some long sustained drives that I thought, obviously took a lot of time off the clock and kept TCU's offense from getting in any kind of rhythm. And I do think, CU does have a lot of talented players on defense, but I think a lot of what happened in the second half was the quarterback changes made, and they went more toward a quarterback run game with the 2 other quarterbacks they got in the game other than Chandler Morris, Max Duggan and Sam Jackson. And I think that kind of threw CU off. And talking to some players this week, it seemed like there was some issues with mentality in the second half too. Maybe guys dropping their heads a little bit too much and getting down the sidelines, which obviously is a pretty big issue in just the first week of the season. But I think the main thing was, the fact that the CU offense was able to keep the TCU offense off the field with some of those long sustained drives.
Tyler, you mentioned the dual quarterback thing with Shrout and Lewis. Both saw significant action in game 1. I mean, just what's different about those 2 guys? It's kind of a little bit of an open competition from what I can tell right now. Just how are those guys different?
Yeah, I think they both fit what Mike Sanford, new offensive coordinator, wants to do. They both can do parts of it. I think obviously you saw early in the first half with Brendan Lewis in there, who was a starter last season, getting involved with his legs with the QB run game. I think that was pretty important and that was pretty successful, but he wasn't really pushing the ball downfield as much. There was one nice throw along the sidelines, Daniel Arias on a 3rd down early on, but that was about it from Lewis from the passing perspective. And Shrout was kind of the opposite. I feel like they brought him in. It was weird. They brought him in for like the 2-minute drill at the end of the first half. And the guy hasn't played college football in multiple years now. I mean, last season he tore his ACL before the start of the season and missed the whole year after transferring from Tennessee in the offseason. And then, his first snap back in college football, they're like, hey, we're backed up at our own 1-yard line. Good luck with 2 minutes to go, which is kind of a weird situation to put him in. But he got him off the goal line and got him toward midfield. Some penalties stalled out the drive, and they didn't get points at the end of the half. But I was impressed with what Shrout did, and I was surprised, honestly, that he wasn't the starter just based off of what I saw in camp. They didn't let us watch too much of practice, and we got a glimpse in 2 live scrimmages, but that was it. But I honestly thought it was going to be Shrout just based off of how much Sanford and Carl Dorrell were talking over the offseason about how much they wanted to pass the ball. push the ball downfield. I think it'll be Stroud going forward, especially this week. Lewis will probably still get some time, but I think Stroud will probably get a longer leash going forward now that I just don't know if Darrell can really, just from a image perspective, send Lewis out there again this week.
I mean, I talked a little bit with Brent about this a minute ago defensively. Stopping the run was an issue against TCU, 275 rushing yards allowed. And knowing Air Force, year in and year out, they're a team that just likes to pound the run. That's kind of their bread and butter. I mean, what's the key to at least somewhat bottling that up? Because I feel like that's a pretty big factor in this game.
Yeah, that's really what I've been writing about so far early this week, is just kind of, what kind of went wrong against the run game. Because like you said, it was a massive disparity in rushing yards from the first half to the second half against TCU. And just kind of talking with players and coaches this week, just kind of like, what did you learn from that, if anything? Because obviously you're going from facing a spread offense to a triple option offense, which can present a lot of challenges. I think a lot of it is just kind of leaning on experiences and really keying in on film. And the one thing I've kind of talked a lot with players this week is about patience and just kind of not getting in their own heads when Air Force, if they break off consecutive runs for 12, 15 yards, just kind of, because Air Force is going to try to have these long methodical drives that take off 7, 8, 9 minutes off the clock. And I think for CU, it's about staying disciplined and patient and just kind of get the stops and stay in your gaps. And like I said, be disciplined, because it is difficult mentally to play a team like Air Force. And, I talked with Robert Barnes yesterday. He was a former Oklahoma transfer. And I don't know if anybody remembers, but, a couple of years ago, Army took Oklahoma to overtime in Norman in 2018. And Robert Barnes was on that team. And he talked about kind of that experience and just like, hey, even though we were a top 5 team, Kyler Murray's our quarterback, we got CeeDee Lamb. We went to overtime with Army just because of how they out-schemed us. And I think a lot of people would say that Air Force is more talented than CU. So what does that say about, what potentially could happen this weekend?
Tyler, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on the Buffaloes. Now we've gotten Tyler's perspective on Colorado, got Brent's about Air Force. And now, Paul, I want to ask you some questions, just some overall things about this game. Just first off, what do you think are the biggest factors for the result of this game?
Well, I think it's probably the most interesting college football matchup we've seen in this state really since 2019, when the Falcons went up to Folsom Field, and anyone who was there or probably watched it on TV can remember it's an overtime game. 2 teams that haven't played in 45 years. A lot of different types of motivation, whether it's guys you played with in high school or against, little brother, big brother. Now those roles are reversed, man. This is the big bad bullies from Air Force hosting a little brother from Boulder, which that's got to tickle a little bit, because I know what the pride is like with this Buffaloes program. Air Force 17-point favorites. My jaw hit the floor when I saw that. I'm thinking back to going to games in the 90s with Eric Bieniemy and Darian Hagan and JJ Flanagan and those guys. If you had asked anyone at that point, Air Force would be a 17-point favorite over CU. I don't think they would believe that you went in the right time machine.
Right.
So this is a whole different deal than we've really ever seen. That's an unheard of number. In terms of what's most important, I think it's when we talked to the Air Force guys yesterday, Mr. Briggeman and I, all the swag is on the Air Force side. That the mojo is all on the Air Force side. They believe they're better than CU, and they believe they're better than CU by quite a bit. So can Buffs flip that around? They're going to have to find some type of mojo early in that game, because like Tyler was saying, there was some doubt in the Buffs locker room the other night, and you can't go to a really good Air Force team with any kind of doubt. Because what Air Force does is they usually do what they do better than what you do well, if that makes sense. It's like the San Antonio Spurs thing. They don't worry about you do. They're going to do what they do. And so I'm interested to see that first quarter, especially on Saturday, to see if CU has reversed that. I think doubt is the right word, or uncertainty, because Air Force, I'm telling you right now, has no uncertainty in how good it is.
Looking at both sides, just who are some key players we should single out and keep an eye on?
I think it's the kid from, Tyler wrote about him, Sneed from Baylor, the transfer wide receiver. He's got to get it cooking. They're going to have to find something outside, especially if they go with JT Shroud, because then the passing game's probably a little more adept. I think it's Sneed. I'm fired up to watch that kid. I've seen highlights. Haven't seen him in person yet, so I'm excited to see him. The Air Force has a very good secondary, but that athleticism and the size that he has, the Falcons talked about it yesterday. Northern Iowa, they had some speed guys that you had to worry about, but they didn't have the size that CU does outside. So a kid like that, 100-yard type game, that's how CU swings the upset. On the Air Force side, I'm not going to go with a player. I think it's the coach. I think it's Troy Calhoun. He would never admit as much, but this is a game that coaches circle. You don't get many opportunities when you get a Pac-12 team in Falcon Stadium. Of course, there was a lot of speculation in this outlet and others that perhaps Troy Calhoun would have been up for that CU job a couple years ago when Mel Tucker left at midnight. So that, to me, if Calhoun has one of those games where he gets to call plays and scheme up the way that he likes to, because he's found some soft spots in CU, it will be a very long day for the Buffs.
Just overall, you talked about Air Force being the bigger brother in this one as of right now. I mean, just what's your overall prediction? Do they cover that 17.5 point spread?
I'm going to say no, actually.
Okay.
I'll probably be in the minority because I've seen where the betting money is going. It's all going on the home team. I think 30-17. I think I haven't seen the over-under, but 30-17, I think it's a 2-touchdown-ish game. It doesn't feel like it's not necessarily a fourth quarter game where the game is in doubt at the end. I think it's going to be very difficult to move the ball against this Air Force defense. A lot of talk about the triple option and what the Falcons do, but I think this defense is very good. So I'll go 30-17. The home team wins, and then everybody surprises us because they announce this is going to be an every year game, because that's exactly what it should be.
Right on, right on. 1:30 kick, Buffalo's Falcons at Falcons Stadium. Should be a great one. A lot of intrigue and some Colorado bragging rights on the line. Thank you so much for joining me, and thank you for watching the Springs Sound Off. This has been fun. I'm Carson Field. We will see you soon.